The Monciel estate stood, imposing and melancholic, on the hill overlooking the small village of Saint-Sylvestre. Its tall, grey stone towers pierced the autumn sky, while its gardens, once renowned throughout the region for their splendour, now stretched into a maze of poorly trimmed hedges and flower beds, where weeds competed with faded roses. Behind the ogival windows of the grand salon, Duchess Hélène de Monciel observed the rain that had been falling relentlessly for 3 days, turning paths into muddy torrents and confining the region's inhabitants to their homes. At 32, the young woman had already been widowed for 5 years. Duke Etienne, her husband, had met his death during a hunting expedition, leaving his young wife alone at the head of an immense domain and considerable fortune. "Your tea, madame," announced Matilda, her lady-in-waiting, gently placing a silver tray on the small table near the window. Hélène turned away from the spectacle of the rain with a weary smile. "Thank you, Matilda. Any news from Dr. Moreau?" "He arrived an hour ago, madame. He is currently examining the orphans with Sister Marie-Claire." Matilda hesitated before adding, "He would like to see you afterward, if you permit." The Duchess nodded silently. The doctor's visit was nothing extraordinary. For 3 years, she had transformed the east wing of the castle, formerly reserved for receptions, into a refuge for orphaned children from the village and surrounding areas. An initiative that had initially scandalized the local nobility, then aroused reluctant admiration before becoming a source of pride for the region. The Duchess of Orphans, as she was now called, had earned the respect of those who previously saw her only as the young foreign wife from Italy whom the old Duke had chosen to perpetuate his lineage. A lineage that, ironically, would end with her, for despite 5 years of marriage, Hélène had never conceived. This secret sorrow, added to the loss of her husband, had gradually transformed the once laughing young woman into the melancholic figure who now haunted the corridors of Monciel. "Madame la Duchesse?" The deep voice of Dr. Moreau interrupted her thoughts. The physician, a man in his 50s with a kindly face framed by a salt-and-pepper beard, stood on the threshold, his wet hat in hand. "Come in, doctor." Hélène invited him, rising to welcome him. "How do you find our charges?" The doctor approached, gratefully accepting the cup of tea that Matilda offered him. "In good health, for the most part. Little Lucy has completely recovered from her bronchitis, and young Thomas is making remarkable progress with his leg. Your decision to bring in that specialist from Paris was judicious." Hélène nodded, relieved. Winter was approaching, and with it its usual share of illnesses. She particularly dreaded this season, when death seemed to lurk closer to the fragile children for whom she had taken responsibility. "However," the doctor continued with a perceptible hesitation, "there's this newcomer, the little boy that Sister Marie-Claire took in last week." "The one who doesn't speak?" the Duchess asked softly. "Precisely. I've conducted a thorough examination, and I find no physical explanation for his mutism. His vocal cords are perfectly formed. His hearing is excellent. It's trauma, I'm certain." Hélène sighed. The young boy, no one knew his name, had been discovered by woodcutters in the Monciel forest, alone, starving, and visibly terrified. From his clothes and appearance, he seemed to be about 8 years old, but the child had not uttered a single word since his arrival, contenting himself with staring at adults with his large, dark blue eyes imbued with an animal-like wariness. "Has he shown any improvement since his arrival?" she inquired. Dr. Moreau seemed to weigh his words. "Physically, yes. He's regaining strength, eating properly. But," he hesitated, "he remains apart from the other children, madame. Sister Marie-Claire confided to me that he wakes up almost every night prey to night terrors, and then there's this strange habit." "What habit?" asked Hélène, intrigued. "He draws, madame. Constantly. Symbols, shapes, sometimes what look like letters, but in no language we recognize. Here, I've brought this. The doctor took a folded sheet of paper from his bag and handed it to the Duchess. Hélène opened it carefully and examined the drawing, a complex intertwining of lines and circles, interspersed with symbols that vaguely resembled ancient runes. The whole gave off a strange, almost hypnotic impression. "It's remarkable," she murmured. "A child so young. These lines are surprisingly precise." "That's what I thought," agreed the doctor. "But Sister Marie-Claire is concerned. The other children are beginning to fear him. They call him the sorcerer when the nuns' backs are turned." Hélène felt her heart tighten. She knew too well the cruelties of which children were capable. Among themselves, the way they perceived and amplified difference. "I would like to meet him," she suddenly decided. "Today, if possible." The doctor looked surprised. Although she generously funded the refuge and regularly inquired about the health of her protégés, the Duchess generally kept her distance from the orphans, delegating their daily supervision to the Sisters of Mercy. Some in the village whispered that it was the pain of her own sterility that kept her away from the children she nonetheless protected with such devotion. "Of course, madame," replied the doctor. "I think it would even be beneficial. This child needs special attention, a privileged bond with someone who could gain his trust." An hour later, after the doctor's departure, Hélène stood before the door of the small room that served as the refuge's infirmary. Her heart was beating strangely fast, as if she were about to cross an important threshold to make a decision that she sensed would change the course of her life. "He's there, madame," whispered Sister Marie-Claire, a nun in her 40s with a gentle face framed by her white coif. "He's drawing, as always." The Duchess nodded and, after a brief hesitation, gently pushed open the door. The room was simple, but comfortable, with its whitewashed walls and large windows that let in the grey light of this rainy day. In the centre, seated at a small table, a thin boy with jet-black hair was bent over a sheet of paper, so concentrated that he did not raise his head at her entrance. Hélène approached slowly, taking time to observe him. The child was pale, his features fine, almost delicate, but his hands that held the pencil firmly betrayed an unsuspected strength. He wore the same outfit as all the orphans, a simple shirt and wool trousers, but something in his bearing, in the tension of his shoulders, immediately distinguished him from the other children she had glimpsed during her rare visits. "Hello," she said softly in Italian, her mother tongue, which she rarely used since her arrival in France 15 years earlier. Then, seeing that he did not react, she repeated her greeting in French. The boy finally looked up, and Hélène was struck by the intensity of his gaze. Eyes of such a deep blue they appeared almost black, framed by long lashes that cast shadows on his hollowed cheeks. An ancient gaze in a child's face. She sat down slowly on the chair opposite him, respecting a prudent distance so as not to frighten him. "My name is Hélène," she said simply. "I live in this castle." The child stared at her without blinking, his pencil motionless above his drawing. No fear in his gaze, she noted with surprise, but a calm, almost calculating assessment. "I've seen your drawings," she continued, indicating the sheet before him. "They are very beautiful, very particular." For the first time, a glimmer of interest crossed the boy's gaze. He lowered his eyes to his drawing, then, in a slow and deliberate gesture, slid it toward her. Hélène examined it carefully. Unlike the previous drawings she had been shown, this one contained no strange symbols, but represented with surprising precision for a child of his age, a tower. One of the towers of Montciel, she recognized, the one that once housed the old Duke's astronomical observatory. "You've drawn the Star Tower," she murmured, using the name the villagers gave to that part of the castle. "Have you seen it from the village?" The boy shook his head slightly, then, to Hélène's great surprise, stood up and approached the window. With a gesture, he invited her to join him. The Duchess complied, intrigued, and indeed saw that from this window one could perfectly see the Star Tower rising majestically above the trees, soaked by the rain. "You are observant," she said with a smile. "That tower was my husband's favorite. He spent hours there contemplating the stars." The boy looked at her again, and something in his expression, an intensity, an almost urgency, prompted Hélène to continue. "My husband died 5 years ago. I live alone here now." She surprised herself with this confidence made to a mute child she had just met. "Well, not quite alone. There are the servants, of course, and all of you, the children of the refuge." A flash crossed the boy's gaze, understanding, recognition. Then he returned to his table and, seizing a new piece of paper, began drawing frenetically. Hélène watched him, fascinated by the sureness of his strokes, the precision of his gestures. In just a few minutes, a new drawing had taken shape, a portrait of a woman, created with astonishing talent for a child of his age. Her portrait, Hélène realized with a shock. The child had just drawn her, capturing with disturbing accuracy not only her features, but also that melancholy that she knew never quite left her gaze. "It's extraordinary," she murmured. "You have a gift." For the first time, the shadow of a smile brushed the boy's lips. He reached toward the drawing, not to take it back, Hélène realized, but to add something. In a few quick strokes, he drew a small boy next to the woman, himself, and their hands joined. The message was clear, even without words. An indefinable emotion gripped Hélène's heart. This broken little being, who had perhaps never known a mother's love, had just reached out to her through a drawing. He offered her a connection, a bond she believed she could never establish again since Etienne's death. "You want to stay with me?" she asked softly, knowing she was venturing into dangerous territory. Attachment to a specific child, when one cared for dozens of orphans, was discouraged by Sister Marie-Claire. All deserved equal attention, impartial love. The boy nodded vigorously, his eyes suddenly animated by a hope so bright it overwhelmed her. At that precise moment, Hélène knew she would break all the rules she had imposed on herself. This voiceless child with such eloquent eyes had just touched something in her that she believed had died long ago. That deep, visceral desire to mother, to protect, to love a child as her own. "Then it's decided," she said with a firmness that surprised even herself. "You will come to live in my apartments. I will personally take charge of your education." The boy's eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with tears. The first, Hélène guessed, that he had allowed himself since his arrival at the refuge. "But you'll need to have a name," she continued softly. "I can't keep calling you the little boy." The child appeared to think intensely, then turned to the window and pointed at the Star Tower. "The tower?" asked Hélène, perplexed. "You want to be called Tower?" The boy shook his head impatiently, then mimed the gesture of looking through. "A telescope. Stars. You want to be called Star." Another negative nod. The child seemed frustrated, desperately trying to communicate. Finally, he seized his pencil and quickly drew a circle with rays all around it. "The sun," suggested Hélène. "You want to be called Sun." This time, the boy nodded vigorously, a smile illuminating his face for the first time. "Sul," murmured Hélène, instinctively using the Latin form of the word. "It will be Sol, then." Thus began a new life for the lonely Duchess and the mute orphan who, in the space of a rainy day, had found in each other an echo to their solitude. What Hélène did not know then was that the child she had just welcomed carried within him a secret that would soon shake the very foundations of her life and of Montiel. The weeks following Sol's arrival in the Duchess's private apartments were marked by a transformation that no one at the castle would have believed possible. Helene, whom the servants had grown accustomed to seeing wander like a lost soul through the silent corridors, gradually regained her energy of old. Her pale cheeks gained a slight colour, and it was not uncommon to hear her laugh, an almost forgotten sound at Montciel, echoing in the library or gardens, where she now spent long hours in the company of the little boy. Saul, for his part, flourished under the constant attention of his benefactress. Although he remained mute, his communication with Helene had developed in a way that many considered miraculous. Together, they had elaborated a sign language, enriched with drawings and facial expressions that allowed them to exchange with surprising fluidity. "It's as if they could read each other's thoughts," whispered Matilda to the other servants with a mixture of admiration and concern. For despite the obvious improvement in the Duchess's mood, certain aspects of this strange relationship aroused perplexity, even anxiety, among the castle staff. First, there was Saul's fascination with the Star Tower. Almost every day the boy insisted on going up there, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by Helene. He could spend hours observing the sky through the old Duke Etienne's telescope, or drawing complex diagrams that even the Duchess, though educated in the sciences, struggled to understand. Then there were the dreams. Helene had installed a small bed for Saul in a cabinet adjoining her room, and almost every night she was awakened by the child's silent cries, his desperate movements in his sleep. When she took him in her arms to calm him, he clung to her, with surprising strength, trembling all over, his eyes wide open, fixed on an invisible point with a terror that broke her heart. In the morning, invariably, Saul rushed to his pencils and frantically drew what he had seen in his nightmares, always the same strange symbols, sometimes accompanied by more precise drawings, a sky on fire, silhouettes lying on the ground, or most troubling, a kind of horseless chariot that seemed to fly above the trees. "They're just nightmares," Helene reassured when Dr. Moreau, coming to examine Saul during his monthly visit, expressed concern about these drawings. "All children have bad dreams." "Certainly, Madame la Duchesse," the doctor agreed, without being entirely convinced. "But these symbols, they recur with troubling constancy, and they resemble nothing known." Helene had thought about consulting a specialist in Paris, perhaps one of those new doctors who studied the human mind, but Saul manifested such panic at the idea of leaving Montciel, even for a few days, that she had abandoned this project. Instead, she had written to Professor Laurent, an old friend of Etienne's, an eminent linguist who had once stayed at the castle to study ancient manuscripts. She had sent him copies of Saul's drawings, hoping he could identify the mysterious symbols that haunted the child's nights. That evening, as autumn slowly gave way to winter and the first snows began to powder the surrounding hills, Helene and Saul were settled in the library before a roaring fire. The Duchess was reading aloud a tale by the brothers Grimm, while the boy, lying on the carpet, drew peacefully. "Madame," interrupted Henri the butler, entering after having discreetly knocked. "A message has just arrived from Paris, from Professor Laurent." Helene felt her heart quicken. After 2 months of waiting, finally an answer. "Thank you, Henri. You may go." Once the butler had left, she broke the wax seal and unrolled the letter. Saul had raised his head from his drawing and was watching her with curiosity. "It's a letter from Professor Laurent," explained Helene. "A scholar who might help us understand your drawings." The boy sat up quickly, his face expressing a mixture of anxiety and hope. He approached Helene and, in a gesture that had become familiar, placed his hand on hers, as if to encourage her to read. "My dear Duchess," she began aloud, "your letter and the drawings it contained have plunged me into a state of perplexity that I had not known since my research on Hittite tablets 20 years ago. The symbols that your young protégé traces do not correspond to any alphabet, any writing system known to modern science." Helene paused, feeling disappointment wash over her. She had so hoped that the professor could provide them with a key to understanding Soul's mysterious drawings, but the rest of the letter revived her attention. However, certain elements appear curiously familiar to me. I have consulted my colleagues in the astronomy department, and one of them, Professor Bertillon, made a fascinating observation. The recurring geometric configurations in these drawings strangely resemble celestial maps, but representing constellations that do not exist. In our night sky, Saul had frozen, his eyes riveted on Helene with an intensity that troubled her. Moreover, she continued, some of the isolated symbols could be interpreted as stylized representations of astronomical phenomena, stars, comets, perhaps even planets. Professor Bertillon suggests, with all the usual scientific reservations, that these drawings could constitute a sort of stellar language, a notation system for describing the sky. Saul's hand was now squeezing Helene's with an almost painful force. She threw him a questioning look, but his face had become indecipherable, as if closed by an emotion too powerful. I cannot encourage you enough, dear friend, to come to Paris. With your young prodigy, a thorough study of his abilities could prove of capital importance to science. In the meantime, I recommend you carefully preserve all his drawings and note the exact circumstances of their creation. The letter ended with polite formulas that the Duchess quickly skimmed, her mind bubbling with questions. A stellar language, constellations that did not exist. What could all this mean? She looked up to share her reflections with Saul, but noted with surprise that the child had moved away. He now stood before the large library window, his gaze fixed on the night sky where a few stars shone between scattered clouds. "Saul," she called softly, "what is it?" The boy turned slowly toward her, and what she saw in his eyes chilled her. An infinite sadness, so deep and so ancient that it seemed to far exceed the possible experience of an 8-year-old child. Then, with sudden determination, he headed for the table where his pencils and papers were. For nearly an hour, in an absolute silence broken only by the crackling of the fire, Saul drew with a frenzy that the Duchess had never seen in him. His little hands flew over the paper, tracing lines and symbols in a kind of creative trance. Helene watched him, divided between fascination and concern, not daring to interrupt this mysterious process. Finally, Saul stopped, and, with an almost solemn gesture, handed her his work. It was not a simple drawing this time, but a sequence of several pages, which, placed end to end, told a story. The first showed a night sky filled with stars, with a particular constellation highlighted. Not one of the familiar constellations of the zodiac, but a formation that the Duchess had never seen, which vaguely resembled a tree with asymmetrical branches. The second page depicted an elongated object, like a gigantic metallic cigar, which seemed to fall from the sky in flames. The third showed a forest, with at the center a small silhouette. A child, Helene realized, with a shock. Saul himself. The following pages depicted the arrival of woodcutters, the discovery of the child, then Montciel, the refuge, and finally Helene herself, taking the little boy's hand. "Saul," she murmured, her throat tight with emotion. "Is this your story? How you arrived in the forest?" The boy nodded gravely, then pointed to the first page, the one showing the strange constellation. "You come from the stars?" she asked, immediately feeling ridiculous for having formulated such a hypothesis. Yet, to her astonishment, Saul vigorously nodded, then pointed to the second page, that of the metallic cigar in flames. A vertigo seized Helene. What the child was suggesting was impossible, fantastic, totally contrary to everything she knew about the world. And yet, it would explain so many things. His mutism, his fascination with the star tower, these mysterious symbols that no linguist could decipher, this intelligence that seemed so advanced for his age. "You're trying to tell me," she articulated slowly, each word costing her an immense effort, "that you are not from this Earth, that you came from another world, in this machine?" Saul stared at her intensely, as if his life depended on Helene's reaction to this extraordinary revelation. Then, slowly, he nodded. A long silence settled between them, heavy with all the implications of this incredible confession. The Duchess felt her rational mind rebelling against the very idea that what Saul suggested could be true. It was madness, delirium, perhaps the manifestation of a trauma so deep that the child had constructed this fantastical story to escape from it. And yet, she remembered Professor Laurent's words, constellations that did not exist in their sky, a stellar language. "Saul," she finally said, her voice barely audible, "why are you showing me this now?" In response, the boy rose and headed for the window, inviting her with a gesture to follow him. Outside, the sky had cleared, revealing a scene of breathtaking beauty. Millions of stars twinkled in the clear night, and one star in particular shone with an unusual, almost supernatural brilliance. "Is that your star?" asked Helene, following the child's gaze. Saul shook his head, then mimed the gesture of someone arriving. "Someone is coming?" Helene's voice betrayed her growing incredulity. "From up there?" The boy nodded, his face imbued with a gravity that did not belong to childhood. When Saul raised 3 fingers, 3 days, 3 weeks, the child pointed to the moon, almost full, visible through the dispersing clouds, then mimed its changing shape. 3 lunar cycles, understood Helene. 3 months. A new nod confirmed her deduction. "And what will happen then?" she whispered, although already fearing the answer. Saul turned to her, and in his eyes she read an infinite sadness mixed with an unshakable resolution. He gently placed his hand on his heart, then extended it toward the sky. The message was clear, devastating in its simplicity. They would come for him. Saul would return to the stars from which he had fallen. "No," breathed Helene, seized by sudden panic. "No, you can't leave." The last few months flashed through her mind. The joy regained, the long, silent conversations with this extraordinary child who had succeeded, without uttering a word, in filling the gaping void left by Etienne's death. The idea of losing him, of returning to her previous solitude, was unbearable to her. "There must be a way," she said with desperate firmness. "We can hide you. No one will know you're here. Or we could leave, travel far away where no one could find you." Saul was gently shaking his head, his eyes filled with tears that reflected the starlight. He took Helene's hand and placed it on his chest, where his heart was, then on hers, as if to say, "We will always be linked, whatever happens." "You don't understand," murmured Helene, tears flowing freely on her cheeks. "Before you I was just a shadow, a ghost haunting this too large castle. You brought me back to life. How could I let you go?" In response, Saul nestled against her, his little arms embracing her with surprising strength, as if he wanted to imprint forever in his memory the sensation of this embrace. They remained thus for a long time, the Duchess and the Child of the Stars, united in their grief and their love, while in the winter sky the unknown star shone with an increasingly bright glow, announcing a future that neither was ready to face. For Saul's secret had just changed everything. In 3 months they would have to face a reality that exceeded human understanding. In 3 months they would have to say goodbye. Unless Helene found a way, any way, to keep with her this extraordinary child who had become, in so little time, the center of her universe. But deep within herself, a small voice whispered that some forces were more powerful than love itself. and that Sol belonged to a world whose mystery she could only glimpse through his enigmatic drawings and his two ancient eyes. Outside, the unknown star pulsed, patient and implacable, counting the days until the promised reunion.